Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's DCRI Research Conference. It's a real pleasure to introduce our Health Services and Outcomes Dynamic Duo, Dr. Leslie Curtis and Dr. Adrian Hernandez. Dr. Curtis is a professor of medicine as well as director of the Pragmatic Health Systems Research Group. Center for Pragmatic Health Systems Research. I'll get it right on the third try.
I could change my name.
She actually does a number of remarkable things, is a long-standing history and some successful outcomes and comparative effectiveness work, which has led to co-directing a number of different important groups, including the Data Core for the FDA's Mini-Sentinel Initiative, co-leading the Electronic Health Record Core for the NIH Healthcare Systems Collaboratory, and co-leading the Data Standards Security Networking and Infrastructure Task Force for the PCORnet, which we'll hear more about today. Dr. Hernandez, well known to the group, is an associate professor here, as well as faculty associate director of the DCRI and director of the Outcomes and Health Services group here. He's on the executive steering committee for a number of trials, as well as the lead for a number of NIH-funded and other government-funded outcomes and comparative effectiveness research studies. And both of them today will be talking about a new way to do research through PCORnet, moving beyond the blueprint.
So thanks, Abdul, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. So we want to give people a highlight of what we've been doing over the last few months in terms of getting PCORnet ready for actually doing research. Leslie has spent dog years, I'd say, in PCORnet, and so she will in particular share some of the great moments here and how things are coming together. So it is actually an exciting time, I think, for all of us here in the Duke community, seeing one of our own getting tapped by President Obama to be leader of the FDA. And so I think people here can imagine that this type of research is going to inform patient care, decision-making, clinicians, stakeholders such as the FDA will be really important. And as a community here at DCRI, hopefully we will be in very good position knowing that the likely principles that will come out from the FDA. So here are our disclosures. And so let me start off with a question for you guys. So yesterday, Leslie and Kevin Weinford and I had the pleasure of spending a day at the NIH talking about the collaboratory and being reviewed by an external advisory panel about whether we're doing anything worthwhile. And Mike Lauer started off the session essentially accusing us in clinical trials of making lemons. And so I guess the question to you guys, do you feel like you make lemons every day? Let's see, how many people have made a lemon for a trial? That is something that you saw on paper that you thought drawn out was perfect, it was high quality, it was reliable, it was better than expected, it didn't cost much, and it got the job done. And his concept here in terms of as a sponsor, as a funder, that he views trials as a failed market, and they're constantly buying lemons. So they get this nice grant. It's 25 pages. It looks beautiful. They have the great team behind it. They say that they're going to do all these things. It's like the ad in the paper or at the used cars lot. That nice wax job makes that car look beautiful. But as you drive off the lot, you notice that the wheels are coming off and perhaps other things aren't working. And so what he is noted is that what they buy every day, they never know really what they're getting. And is it going to be a lemon today, or is it going to be something that they really want? And so the idea around this is that there needs to be more predictable pathways and understanding of whether a study is going to be successful. And they do not want to buy or be at risk for buying any more lemons. And so he really was posing the question to us is from a sponsor, do we really want to continue selling studies that he knows, based on the data they have, that in general, if you look at aggregate data, that they are often unreliable, costly, and slow. And so that is one of the key things that I think all of us here at DCRI are aimed to address and have been addressing over the years. And through programs like PCORnet, we should be in a good position for that. So today we're going to just cover a few topics in terms of the evolution of PCORnet and what's the problem we're trying to solve, what is PCORnet for those who have not heard about it, where do we stand in terms of the data and how it's positioned to answer questions, what are the projects underway currently to start off PCORnet, what have we learned so far, and what's on the horizon. So first, in terms of what's the problem that we're trying to solve. So I think you probably have heard over and over that there's this concern about efficiency in research, that if you go and look at a variety of reports, whether it's from Tufts or other reports, that studies take longer and longer, and the complexity of procedures for a given trial continues to increase. So the number of procedures for a trial has increased by 65%. This translates into extra work for study coordinators and extra burden for patients. This increases the length of trial. This has negative consequences in terms of enrollment rates and retention rates. And when you look at what's happening on a site level, this translates into sites working harder. So working harder for the same amount of money. And as you adjust for inflation and other factors, you can see that the mean site work effort continues to climb. And this translates, not surprisingly, less bang for the bucks, where the number of patients that are recruited for studies is going less and less. And so you can extrapolate this and note that we're still going down into an area where I worry about U.S. research still. This will be a question perhaps that someone in Congress may ask a nominee of how are you going to fix this R&D and efficiency. So this was published in Nature a couple years ago, and it's a nice line showing the drug approval process and what's happened in terms of the number of drugs. And then what's also been noted separately is the amount of money needed to get a single drug approved, including opportunity costs, failures, expanded requirements for trials. So $2.6 billion, even Donald Trump would not be able to handle easily. This has led worries in terms of offshoring research as R&D gets more expensive in the U.S. Where is it going to take place? And so you can see in Asia, and while we have a lot of friends in Singapore as part of Duke and U.S., the research that's happening in terms of biomedical research overall, and this includes basic science, but also importantly clinical science, getting moved outside of the U.S. The Senate has noted this, and while there's been a lot of talk about 21st century cures and the House passing that legislation, I think everyone here knows that the Senate controls really everything, and if they don't want to do anything, nothing really moves. And the Senate, with our own senator chairing the Health Committee, has led this document called the Innovation for Healthier Americans. And what they note is that everything takes too long and costs too much. But what they also note is that there are opportunities to improve clinical trials. So you may imagine that this Senate committee that has to approve the FDA's nominee for commissioner, that they'll be asking questions about how can this happen. And this turns out to be an economic issue. It's not only kind of for patients getting things better sooner to patients, but really an economic issue for U.S. research. So now let me turn it over to Leslie. She's going to talk about what is PCORnet and go through our data.
Adrian tried to give me his phone just then, which isn't going to work so much. And he promised like a spin move when he gave me the mic, but he didn't deliver on that either. Okay, what is PCORnet? So what PCORnet aims to do is to really bring together resources, populations, and expertise and data from the participating organizations to create this national infrastructure that allows us to do high-quality research that is patient-centered and efficient. The sort of the bumper sticker that we often use is research infrastructure done differently. This is a different way of doing research. We've identified about 5 hallmarks of PCORnet research. Like, how will we recognize when we've arrived at the PCORnet that we're trying to create here? The first is that we'll have highly engaged patients, clinicians, health system researchers, and other partners. So the community will be highly engaged in the work that we're doing. And that collaborative community will be supported by a very robust governance structure, right? Understanding sort of how we do this research, how we work together, how we access data, who gets to use it, who answers questions. And those data would be maintained in an analysis-ready, standardized format so that we're not having to, every time we have a question, recreate the infrastructure that then we tear down when the next question comes along. Privacy protections are absolutely essential and have to be baked into that infrastructure. The governance and oversight has to protect patients while at the same time supporting that timely conduct of research to again get to that nirvana that well, Adrian didn't quite describe the nirvana. He hinted at what the nirvana should look like, and that is one that is timely research done efficiently. And then I think number 5 is especially important in that this has to be research that is sustainable in the context of healthcare delivery systems, and that's a big challenge. As we know now, the research infrastructure often sits alongside or separate to the healthcare delivery system. So really, the goal is to bring those two together. I want to talk a little bit about the data infrastructure that underlie PCORnet and talk about how PCORnet plans to answer questions using this infrastructure. By way of sort of broad introduction, just to refresh our memories, PCORnet funded initially 11 clinical data research networks and 18 patient-powered research networks. The clinical data research networks were each required to stand up a technical infrastructure that would support their network that had to bring at least 2 health systems and 1 million covered lives to the table. And they had to do a lot of other things, several other milestones that went along with that. But I'm going to talk now about that infrastructure that the CDRNs in particular have been standing up. All of them have now transformed their data, each of them having at least 1 million patients, into the PCORnet Common Data Model. And I know you're dying to know more about that, and I have slides about it. But so just we'll get to that. And what we've observed so far, and I'll touch on some of this a little bit later as well in the context of the projects that we're doing, obtaining complete data in the way that we think we on the research side of the aisle think about the data we need to answer questions. That's a bit of a challenge. The electronic health records that are used to create this infrastructure have amazingly deep clinical data in them, and yet we only know what we know when the patient comes to a given health system for care. So to the extent that they're going to multiple health systems, not all of which are in that network's catchment or in that network's group of participating health systems, we have missing data problems. So that's a challenge, and also a challenge, frankly, to bring in the kind of insurance payer type data that could provide a foundation for defined patient time or defined person time. I'll talk in a little bit about the obesity demonstration projects, which really are the first test of this system in terms of how it will be able to be used for observational studies. So I'll get to that. Right now, we've sort of guesstimated that we have about 75 million patients represented in PCORnet data marts around the country. The bullet there says there are lots of disclaimers and caveats around that number, and there are. I won't list them right now, but it's a big number and one that we expect to grow over time. So you may hear us talk about distributed research networks, and if you've been to previous research conference when we've talked about those, you may have an understanding of that concept. But the general idea is that the data that comprise the PCORnet network, if you will, they actually sit in health systems around the country. That is, there's no kind of centralized database that holds data for 75 million patients. Rather, the data physically reside in each of these networks. I want to talk today a little bit about some of the building blocks of the distributed research network, because I think it will help us understand better how the demonstration projects will work and really how PCORnet is envisioned to work. Actually, maybe let me just touch on, I'm going to talk, I mentioned already the network partners, right? The clinical data research networks, there are 11 there. For the purposes of today, I'm really going to focus, think primarily about those clinical data research networks, not the patient-powered research networks. The patient-powered research networks are very important in terms of engaging patient populations, but as you might imagine, the underlying data that they capture about patients varies considerably depending on the disease or condition. So think about this from the clinical data research network perspective. And the second bullet, I should just say that everything that we've done in building this infrastructure really rests on a set of guiding principles that we established at the beginning. I'm not actually going to go through those today, but it's important to know that we've done that so that as questions arise, where do we go next? How do we build next? As those questions come up, we often go back to those guiding principles to remind ourselves, what were we trying to do? What were the guardrails we put up at the beginning? And how does that, and that actually allows us to move forward, I think, more quickly. So this is actually a great graphic put together by Jonathan Cook here at the DCRI to explain how a distributed research network works. And the basic idea here is that we have within each of these, within each of the green circles, we have actually that's showing the PPRNs that I've just told you we're not going to talk much about. So let's focus on the blue circle there that shows the data marts, the data from the clinical data research networks. Those all physically sit at these sites around the country, and all of them have been mapped to a common kind of format, right, that I'll talk about in a minute. And what that means, what that allows is for a question to come through the coordinating center. A question comes through, somebody has a question, sends it to the coordinating center. That question is converted to a query, to a standardized program, a set of code that can be sent to all of the data marts within the network so that they can execute that code and return the results without modifying the code at all. So rather than saying to everyone, hey, we're interested in a study that does this, here's the spec, you all code it, and then we deal with whatever comes back. We lay out the code, we provide it, we send it out, and what we get back is results. All of this requires and is built upon a secure portal so that this goes about without concerns about data privacy. The secure portal is powered by a software called PopMedNet that some of you may have heard about, developed by my colleague Jeff Brown, and now really moving forward under the guidance of Lincoln Peak out of in Boston. So anyway, this is the way this is envisioned to work, and the coordinating center is responsible not only for translating the question into a query that can be distributed to the sites, but also then for bringing the responses together and forming an answer out of those. It's critical to remember here that at all times the CDRNs maintain physical and operational control of their data. When we send a query, the query does not sort of go into their firewall and automatically execute and then sends back results to us. Rather, the query goes to them, and what they get is basically the equivalent of an email that says, hey, there's a question for you, right? And then they get to review that and decide when and how to respond. We set some benchmarks or some expectations around how quickly they'll respond, but the choice to respond is theirs. Some of you may think this sounds familiar to what we've done in Sentinel, and it is. I'll tell you that there, the same rules apply, and I can probably count on one hand the number of times that a data partner has said, no, I'm not going to respond to that. And usually when that happens, it's because the data partner knows something about their data that would actually make that query not a good one to answer in their data. So it works quite well. I mentioned that all of these activities are secure and audited, which is a very important consideration for our partner networks.
Who's doing the auditing?
Pardon me?
Who's doing the auditing? Is that centrally through PCORnet?
So when I say all of the activities are secure and audited, that means there's an audit trail of all of the querying, and that's baked into the software. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. These distributed analysis methods that I've described really allow us to only share the minimum necessary information. We say that's what you should request, and that's what we'll share. The coordinating center is responsible for overseeing that minimum necessary policy implementation. Now, as you might imagine for a trial, minimum necessary is different from what it is for a prep to research query. And again, the coordinating center is responsible with the executive committee of PCORnet is responsible for making sure that policy is in place. We've found, certainly from the work we've done with Sentinel, that a lot of analyses can be completed without sharing any protected information. So we share risk sets, propensity scores, and also highly aggregated and summarized person-level information. We're doing a lot of things in Sentinel without any sort of true patient-level data in the way that we would typically think of it being exchanged. And that's really important for the observational studies that I'll talk about. As promised, we have a PCORnet common data model that I'm happy to say really has been developed and developed here by the team at Duke with great lots of input from our colleagues at Harvard Pilgrim. The data model started with I would say started on a foundation that was well established by Mini-Sentinel and focused on those data areas that we expect health systems to have readily available. So we began with encounters, diagnoses, procedures, demographics, and then over time have expanded that to include other data areas that we and our partners believe are important. Here, in phase 1 of PCORnet, we did actually 3 versions of the PCORnet common data model. So if Shelley Resenkovich looks like she's aged considerably in the last year, this will explain why. But she doesn't. I'm just saying if she did, that would be why. The PCORnet common data model here, I've highlighted in red, we've circled the things that are new to version 3 of that, which gives you a sense of kind of, that was a big version change, and added some prescribing data, a trial table, information about the data harvest, as well as kind of clarification and addition of other elements along the way. So when we think about that standardized those standardized programs that we'll be running, think of this is your data dictionary, right? So when we're asking questions, these are the data that we have at our disposal, readily available to answer those questions. think I've touched on that, the new domains in version 3. The expectation in phase 2 of PCORnet, which begins in a few weeks, I think, is not that we would do 3 more versions of the common data model, but that our focus would really shift toward using these data, understanding how we need to make it better, rather than continuing sort of a rapid cycle development process. Okay, so what are we actually doing? What projects are underway? I'm going to start by talking about the obesity studies that we have that are starting up, and then we'll turn it back to Adrian for the discussion of the trial. This is a really important concept to keep in mind. Many, if not all, parts of PCORnet are under construction, which might lead the sane person to say, then why are you actually doing research using this infrastructure? And the answer is because we'll only know truly how to develop it, to do research, by doing that work. So there's a real commitment to learning by doing, learning by answering questions. And in fact, when we articulated the goals of these observational studies, we said explicitly, we have to be answering important questions for sure, and we have to recognize that this is an opportunity for us to test and then also refine the capabilities that PCORnet has and should have. And it's not just about the data, although sometimes those of us who work with the data think it's a lot about the data, but it's also about the governance that allows us to do multi-center research. It's about administrative simplicity, institutional review review board kinds of issues, certainly about the data, and also about having these reusable analysis tools so that we're not in a position of coding programs every single time a question comes in, but rather reusing tools that work for the kinds of questions that we're asking. Okay, I'm going to do just a very quick walk through the 2 obesity-related studies that have been funded by PCORnet have been funded by PCORI for execution within PCORnet. And the first one focuses on short and long-term outcomes related to bariatric surgery. And for those of you who are active in this area of research, you know that there's been a real shift in the types of bariatric procedures that are being used in the US. And so that landscape gave rise to this specific question that said we want to be able to compare these procedures that are all being used, and with a focus on looking at weight loss and regain as outcomes, and then other obesity-related outcomes, including type 2 diabetes and adverse outcomes, hospitalization, reoperation, and death. As of now, there are 10 of the 11 CDRNs participating in this, and that includes about 53 sites, so 53 nodes, if you will, within the network. In preparation of the application, the study team created a table that gave some preliminary counts. And this data includes data from about 44 of the 53 sites. And I would simply just call your attention to the fact that we have quite large numbers. So if you're familiar with gastric bypass, the gastric bypass literature, you'll recognize that these are in fact, these are lots of patients for these studies. Many of the patients, although certainly not all, have BMI at baseline and at 3 years. Race and ethnicity, and BMI before and after. That's a pretty good set as well. And then we even have some adolescents, which is pretty exciting because I'm not aware of another data source where you would have adolescents and BMI in the same.
You have the data, not that they require the.
What's that?
Not that they require. There's adolescents.
No, that's not the good part. That we have the data. We can answer the question. That's right. Let's see. We were also encouraged to see that the bariatric surgery procedure types that have been reported nationally actually bear quite a striking similarity to what we see in PCORnet, which again sort of bolsters our confidence that the answers to the questions we're posing will in fact be generalizable. And in the interest of time, because Adrian's got some good stuff at the end, I want to move on to the second obesity study, which is looking at short and long-term effects of antibiotics on childhood growth. So as you may be aware, there's growing interest and recognition that how we treat kids with antibiotics may have implications for obesity in the long term because it alters the biome. And so this gave rise to this question. There was a great paper that came up in pediatrics that really highlighted this potential association between antibiotics in infancy and early childhood obesity, which then gave rise to the study that PCORnet will be doing. I didn't note at the outset, but should have, that one of the networks is actually a pediatric, one of the clinical data research network is a pediatric network led by Chris Forrest and out of CHOP in Pennsylvania. And so this is of keen interest to them, but certainly to all of the CDRNs who have pediatric populations. Short and long-term, the goals of this then are to compare different antibiotics used in the first couple years of life. Outcomes of interest include BMI and the risk of being overweight and obese in the third to fifth years of life. Also, we'll be looking at growth trajectories through the preschool ages. Again, preliminary data compiled for the application were fairly encouraging that we have, in fact, this number of children for whom we have what appear to be robust follow-up data over the time. We expect now that about 38 sites from the 9 CDRNs will participate in that study. And now the dance.
Okay, so we'll actually have a full session on adaptable, the first pragmatic trial for PCORnet another time, and we're already learning a lot of things as we start up. And so let me just give a few highlights. And the reason to think about adaptable as well as the obesity studies is would like the group to envision how one can leverage PCORnet for addressing questions that have come up either clinically or come up via patients, and thinking about how to change the exposure or the cohort, the exposure, and the outcome using the PCORnet framework. Because that's really what it's being built for, is to be used across medicine. And the question here for adaptable is simply everyday patients go and get aspirin over the counter. And you would never think that a simple choice of what dose of aspirin over the counter could make a difference. We're actually hoping soon that Jillian will put some good numbers behind this. This is our back of the envelope number. What's the potential challenge for public health? But it's estimated around just under 20,000 deaths and heart attacks could be saved depending on the dose of aspirin, and then thousands of bleeds. And so the difference between 81 and 325 milligrams of aspirin, based on prior studies, highlights that there is this actually potential large public health problem that could be addressed by simple choice over the counter. And so that's the question scientifically, clinically, that's being addressed by adaptable is, does the dose matter between 81 and 325? And it's evaluating this against primary outcomes of all-cause mortality, MI, and stroke, and then also safety endpoints of bleeding, and then evaluating whether there is any difference in outcomes based on aspirin dosing on different populations. So older patients, women versus men, race and ethnic minorities, etc. But a central aim, as the obesity studies highlighted, is to actually use this to develop and refine the infrastructure of PCORnet and allow this to be a test bed, if you will, of how to do large pragmatic trials. Now, who in the room here has randomized 20,000 patients at less than $1,000 a patient? So not yet, but there will be people in this room that will have done this at soon, hopefully. This is the basic construct for adaptable. So it's aimed for 20,000 patients who have coronary vascular disease plus an enrichment factor. And I'll talk a little bit about this, that they'll be identified electronically, approached electronically, and followed up electronically. And then we'll look at these outcomes over the next 3 years. This is really just getting started, but just to give a high-level overview of how things are being organized is that patients would be identified in the networks using the data warehouses that those networks have put together. We'll actually be able to collect baseline information using the common data model of those patients. And then they'll be followed up periodically for patient-reported outcomes, health status, and medication use and adherence, both electronically, so as they enroll and be able to get pinged electronically and put their information via an adaptable patient portal. But for those patients who are not internet savvy or don't use the portal, then we'll have our follow-up call center follow up those patients. In the background, we'll actually be doing more systematic collection of outcomes using as patients have health encounters in their networks or their hospitals, those encounters will actually be captured via the common data model, and so we'll have those outcomes. And then finally, kind of the other net to capture complete outcomes is taking the adaptable patient population and linking it to Medicare data via the Medicare Enclave, and then also other private payers. So that way we actually have a much more systematic outcome ascertainment than what we probably have today in a lot of trials, especially those trials that have infrequent follow-up, and it's dependent on a study coordinator and a 10-minute visit to ask the patient whether they had any events, and for that patient to remember whether that event happened within the last 6 months, and also go through the thousands and thousands of notes that are hidden in Epic that are hard to find. So that is kind of the main framework for that. And then for the patient involvement, patients have been involved from the get-go, and they sit on a variety of committees. The executive committee, the DSMB has patients on there, and those are areas where we actually are still learning how to get patients educated in terms of DSMB activities, et cetera. But as we go forward, we'll be capturing the lessons or issues through the development and execution of adaptable and culling that information in terms of generalizable knowledge of what are lessons that can be applied for future pragmatic trials, future trials that are leveraging this type of model with PCORnet. We're essentially trying to identify patients electronically, as much as possible, approach them electronically, follow them up electronically, and do large studies that can answer simple questions that have a large public health impact. Already, this is one of my favorite slides that was developed as part of a response to peer review, was how does adaptable compare to traditional trials? And this is something that we will want to take from not just regarding PCORnet, but also how we should rethink doing trials and doing pragmatic trials. And I know we'll have much more on this at another conference where the team, and led by Lisa, can go through all the different factors that you would think about in terms of as you are developing a protocol and executing, how you can go from what's done traditionally to something that's much more streamlined taking advantage of systems that we have now. And so to great credit to Matt and Lisa and Ty and others, they've gone through countless revisions of our research plan and protocol, and thinking about all these different things that come up in terms of conducting a trial and how it can be better. To give you some highlights of what the patient population could look like, this is data from 5 of our CDRNs that are participating. We expect there will be about 7 or 8 networks that participate. You can see here the numbers of patients with heart disease is not the problem. It's actually reaching those patients and being able to engage them and enroll them is the key challenge. And that is something that when people talk about, well, all we need is a data solution, there is this thing between a patient and their data, and that's called a clinician. And so how do you ensure that those clinicians are engaged is important. But just to give you the bottom line number, over 600,000 patients are eligible for adaptable in these networks. So any individual network could conceivably do the whole trial. But yet, like this kind of trial, we typically take 400 sites globally. Yeah?
Do you have a sense of those 600,000, how many of them are currently on low dose, high dose, or no dose? Or do you?
The vast majority are on aspirin, but since it's an over-the-counter medication, it's not very well quantified in terms of the dose on a patient level. But if you look at other studies, about 2/3 on high dose and 1/3 on low dose. That's actually shifting though.
Right.
So.
Adrian,
Yeah.
how do you think, like the primary care providers or the providers of the patients are taking to this? Because they're not involved, it seems, because the patients are going online, consenting themselves, getting randomized, the data is being pulled through, Epic and all different mechanisms. So how do they feel as a treating physician? Because it's something so new and different where the patient is deciding, hey, I'm going on to this study,
So
and now treatment is being different.
So while we don't want to have any artificial barriers for patients to get into research, because if you ask patients, they actually want to be part of it, and they have a lot of worries about paternalism in terms of limiting their chance of doing research. But we also think it's critical that there's clinical engagement, that there are physicians that the patients trust and know, understand what the study's about, understand that they're being approached, and actually in some scenarios, or depending on the system, actually say, yes, these are the, out of this list, these are the patients that can be approached. And when patients get approached, it's either they're going to ask a family member or their trusted physician about this, and so we think that's important. So Matt and Ro and Skylar have been thinking a lot about that because, this is going to be a direct question that comes up in terms of its success, and I've already had that clinical engagement, laying that groundwork already. So, but this will be something that, and actually from a PCORI standpoint, they actually want us to quantify what are those touches and how that has an impact, which is pretty hard to do. So in the last few minutes, let me just touch on what have we learned so far. And so I don't know who gave this grand rounds. I don't know if it was Rob or Rich or whoever, but they outlined top 5 needs for PCORnet, and noted that there need to be engaged clinical organizations and patients, a collaboration framework, analysis-ready standardized data, ability to embed research in care settings, and regulatory oversight. So as we kind of finish up phase 1, and it finishes up in a few weeks at the end of October, we can say that all these systems have really been engaged. On a high level, institutional level, they're highly engaged. If you want to see patient engagement, you should attend one PCORnet meeting. That is patient engagement. And they have an incredible voice for this, and they want answers to their questions and to their needs. Recently, we officially completed a governance policy, so that actually cements what's the collaboration framework for this. And so already we're seeing study proposals coming together spontaneously via the different networks, including patient-powered research networks. Leslie highlighted that the approach for analysis-ready standardized data is ongoing, and data marts are being stood up as we speak. The things that, at least in my view, are still incomplete are things that are still much more of a work in progress because we really haven't tested this out is the ability to embed research. So to Beth's question, I think that's a key thing that we don't know yet how we're doing there, and or do we have everything right? Because we can certainly hear from institutional leadership that this is important, but is it really embedded in terms of care settings and how to think about that, especially for a strategy of care studies? Regulatory oversight. Those are things that are still in progress in terms of having a centralized IRB, for instance, and while the networks individually have those kind of governances in place across the PCORnet, that's something that's a work in progress. The good news is that there are a lot of collaborators. There's a lot of interest in terms of federal partners, and so we look like we may actually have some additional funding from ASPE, for example, to look at some methodologic questions regarding adaptable. That's going to be led by Emily O'Brien. We have ongoing collaborations with FDA and the different divisions, NIH, and particularly the NIH Collaboratory and the leadership there, and also Mike Lowry and Cheryl BI are highly invested in PCORnet and are seeing this as a great opportunity. There's overlap in terms of the recently announced Precision Medicine Initiative with Bray Patrick Lake, who was a co-chair of that, and Rich Platt, who is on the work group for that. The CTSA program is largely overlapped with PCORnet. 62 of the 63 centers for CTSA are PCORnet. And we have these back and forth dyads between the CTSA leadership to ensure that the national research infrastructure that's being built by both programs is complementary and synergistically aligned. And then CDC as well. So just in terms of some of the research readiness, where we stand to date and what we've learned, we're really just beginning this. So an example that is just, you would think it'd be pretty simple to have a consent form for, we're going to randomize you to 1 of 2 doses of aspirin. It seems like it would be a minimal risk study, and the input and engagement's been incredible from various IRB leaders, but I never knew there were so many English majors out there in the IRB. So, and we, actually the group here led by Laura Beskow actually did something that's hardly ever done, which is actually engage patients developing the consent form, testing it out. As full disclosure, my mother was a volunteer for that group, and so she gave me a hard time about why we don't know that answer for aspirin. So, but there are things are still to be done here to work on. Towards this concept of administrative simplicity, I imagine everyone in this room has had a problem or a pain point in terms of getting something quickly through an IRB, ensuring that it protects human subjects, and then also ensuring that we have a study up in time for contracts. And so these are areas that are currently under development, here, and while the individual networks have worked out agreements within their internal network, how to knit those things together, put the interstate together between the so-called 13 states is still being built. Fortunately, there's progress being made on these fronts, and actually Matthew Catania in our contracts group is part of the contract working group who also helped develop what's called the ACTA for the CTSA, or a Master Trial Service Agreement there, and really taking that experience and leverage into PCORnet. And so taking our internal expertise to put this together, and also ensuring that people understand that for a portfolio of research that PCORnet is likely to have, including industry, we need to have certain approaches for that, and also different types of studies, which is a little bit different than, say, some other networks. So what's on the horizon? Soon, we want to ensure that we are translating this research readiness to actually doing research, the effectiveness, making sure that building blocks are cemented together, opening up officially PCORnet, so-called for business, and then scaling these capabilities from individual networks to networks of networks, doing multiple studies across the spectrum. We also are aiming to get 2 work groups to finalize their work products towards centralized IRB, as well as master contracts, and both of those are in midstream and with aims of deliverables by the end of the year. And we need a front door. So we want people to think about PCORnet and what ideas they have, but we also want to make sure that they know where to go. And it's not just Leslie's cell phone or texting like, I have an idea. While I am certainly a fan of that, and we can post that number, I worry about her responsiveness if that was the case. And so we have a work group that's developing a policy and procedures that's led through here of how to go and get an idea out there. One is just to understand, is it feasible? What's the numbers that potentially exist for this condition, and have preliminary data to consider for extramural funding? 2, in this environment where things are increasingly important to understand or engage patients to understand what's important, how to make those connections, how to broaden those connections so a matchmaker function. And then 3rd is actually how to put together a winning proposal. So like how to convene the right group of a multidisciplinary team to put together a winning proposal. And then finally, you'll hear people talk about like, oh, we want to be Uber, we want to be Amazon, and so forth. But it is really necessary to think about what's the business model for PCORnet. Because PCORI, they are funding this for the next 3 years with plans of this being a sustainable infrastructure. And so in that regard, you have to have a reliable, sustainable business model that's going to be responsive to the current dynamically changing environments for clinical research. And in that regard, we want to consider like what are the key traits for that, and how many of these do we want to check off? And where do we concentrate in terms of that spectrum of research? I think in general, like PCORnet will be well positioned for pragmatic observational studies and pragmatic trials. As things go forward, that could even evolve where you can imagine things that are pre-market. But right now, I think those are things that are down the road, or perhaps hybrid approaches. And then something that we probably have not completely seized yet is the power of the patient. So it's amazing that these groups of patients have come together. And one of the things that we constantly hear is that there's been a ton of attention to just putting the cement down for PCORnet, but how do you make sure that the patients are fully engaged in a way that will really power the network, bringing issues to light? And it's probably no surprise that you see the FDA is also interested in this as well, as they just formed a patient group there to inform them as they go forward. Similarly, patient power, you can imagine, will continue to expand as going forward in phase 2. And it does represent a great opportunity to engage with patients that bring new questions and new points of view. So we actually had started putting together a list of people who've contributed to PCORnet to do our thank you slide. That list went over 5 slides. So I just want to thank everyone as part of the PCORnet team. I'm sure in some way, in some fashion, that most everyone in this room and has touched an element of PCORnet or will be doing so at some point to make it successful. And so thanks in advance as well. And then just some parting, do want to remind everyone that, I think we are fairly well aligned, and it is time in the season to think differently and seize these opportunities. And so I'm trying to see if we can make some hats like this that next time any of us are in DC, if we can track down a nominee for the FDA, that we can give him a hat to wear as he goes through his interviews. So thanks very much, and we're happy to answer questions, and Leslie will take the hardest questions. Beth, do you have the easy one?
I have an easy. It was just about the informed consent. So they're on the portal giving informed consent. And then I guess there's a feedback mechanism to your CDRN as you're taking the data to inform them that this patient provided consent over here.
So I heard that. I heard that as volunteering to be on the adaptable data team. So we've written, yeah, actually, those are exactly the issues that we're actively working through right now. Yeah.
So I guess to your question, for a trial, would we get informed consent? The answer is yes. And also it's important to make sure that that's tracked in a way that's fashionable. Right now, so we're working with a company called Mitris that is developing a e-consent platform for us. And we think that's actually something that can be scalable to a lot of trials, not necessarily just adaptable or PCORnet even. So, and there's actually a lot of things that actually should be studied just in that area specifically.
Susan?
I just wondered at the end of the day with Mike Lauer, what was the outcome of the discussion if you started with lemons?
Yeah. So so after he told us the story about how he keeps buying lemons and he thinks that we're a failed market, we told him we're Duke, and but no, we actually agree with that, and that there are unknowns that we should be able to figure out better pathways here. And for example, with something like PCORnet, we should be able to understand more fully what's the eligible population and how to optimize that, and how to actually reach patients more effectively, and how to engage stakeholders for these issues, whether it's approaching patients, having patients involved, approaching clinicians, the consent issues, all those kind of things. And so that kind of planning period's an important element. So
just to pick up on that, I mean, one of the things that the collaboratory has done, that the NIH did in the collaboratory, was to fund each of those trials in 2 phases. A planning phase, a 1-year planning phase, followed by the actual implementation phase. So I think one of the things that Mike Lauer at the end has really quite bought into that approach. Like, give people the funding to actually get to that point where they can show that they can do the trial, as opposed to making the decision before you actually have that information.
And that's something we're advocating for as we think about, especially new models of research. We don't want, we want to make sure that there's a period of time where people have the willingness to bring up issues, to experiment, to try something new, and not just think that it'll be a failure.
Charlotte?
Yeah, I think this is great, and obviously, the way of the future, and we've got a great system already. And I can see how putting up this trial when you're doing it while you're laying the foundation and doing the work at the same time is a way to evaluate whether you can do it and whether you can do it efficiently and fast and get lots of patients. But I wonder if you have a way to evaluate whether you got the right answer or the data quality, because my limited experience in electronic health record data is can be problematic. And if you were to do this as a traditional trial, would you get different answers than if you did it as a pragmatic trial?
So I guess one question, I think probably we've all been using electronic health data. The Duke Cardiovascular Data Bank is that before there was even this idea of electronic health data. And your question about whether we'll have the right answer, it's definitely interesting to understand that. So I think breaking up into two parts. One is actually, if you consider clinical trials today, they tend to have a much narrower population. So one principal aim is to expand the population to groups that haven't been studied before. And so in that regard, I think we'll be generating knowledge that's not been tapped out before. Regarding the data quality, I'll turn it over to Leslie because she knows about that.
I think it's a great question. And one of the things that I really didn't touch on was just the data characterization, data quality assessment that we're doing as part of PCORnet. I don't want to, it's even just sort of making sure that we have things that are consistent with what we've asked them to do. That's critical, but maybe necessary but not sufficient for what we're talking about. But that kind of data characterization, data quality assessment will be baked into the work of the trial as well. But your point's a good one. I think it's all that we can do is sort of manage as we go.
And for adaptable itself, that's a requirement that the advisory panel had, was doing validation work along the way, both for the outcomes and some other elements. The other thing to just think about is that the data that's going to be used is considered what's available routinely in clinical care. So I keep grumbling to Leslie that we need ejection fraction. We just need ejection fraction, and she keeps telling me that's impossible because it's not routinely available in electronic health records.
Well, it may be routinely available, but not in a way that's easy just to sort of pull into something.
Yeah. Other questions? Gretchen?
Yeah, I'm curious about your sample for adaptable. So, you probably explained it and I didn't get it, but are you going to select people from the whole PCORnet database and extend an invitation and then the patient decides? How does that?
Yeah, so it'll vary by network or health system. So what I've advocated is having a national randomization day where one day we turn on the email and just send it out to 600,000 patients and see what happens. That apparently is operationally a challenge, and so we're not quite there yet, but maybe we'll be there. But to be fair, some systems, I'll give you two examples. So Vanderbilt has a very well-characterized cohort of patients with cardiovascular disease that they've already surveyed for other reasons as part of their network for PCORI, and had actually already put out there the question of this aspirin study. At that time, it didn't have a name, but essentially asking, would you want to be part of research and would you want to be part of this study when it becomes available? And so they already have a cohort of patients, around 4,000 or 5,000, that they can reach electronically when this goes live. But they also have plans to kind of work through as patients come through their clinics to be able to reach out to them earlier as part of their clinic visit to say, would you be interested in this study as well? Other programs like Louisiana have that same type of recruitment plan where they're going to do things as they kind of encounter the healthcare system as part of their routine care. But still, most of those things still require some clinician engagement saying is this okay?
So what is your population supposed to be?
So it'll be 20,000. And so one question that comes up is that you can imagine the patients that are approached electronically and consented electronically, are they different than those patients who are coming through normal encounters? We truly don't know the answer to that because as access to internet, et cetera, and use of smartphones and iPads have expanded in email, that we don't really know what the differences are. But you can imagine that there are likely population characteristics or differences between the so-called non-internet savvy patient population and the internet savvy population, and that's something we'll have to look at as we go forward.
You know, one of the things that we're struggling with modeling wise with this is, so patients who are on nothing, patients that have been successfully on a high dose one for a while, or patients that are successfully on a low dose one, are different patient populations. And so one of the questions is what question do you really want to answer for the downstream patients? Do you want to answer kind of this, what's right to start someone on, or if someone's on high dose and should switch them? Because if someone's on high dose and has been successfully, going along on high dose, does that make them a different patient?
Well, I think one could argue you don't necessarily know. So so the example, there are a lot of examples, and hypertension is a good field where there are, most patients who get into those trials have actually been on medications. And so, but it's not for the naive patient, because that's just, we won't have that population. So like the new start, such as like a patient who had their first MI, that's not the question, but the question is kind of long-term effectiveness. What's the benefit-risk ratio of that answer?
Yeah, it's just hard for us to try to figure out whether we need to model those as different types of patients, or whether we can just say, we don't care that you've successfully been on high dose for...
Whatever can we get to by December.
Yeah, no.
We'll start there.
Yeah.
Thanks for taking on this important work and sharing it with us.